am recording. All right. So this webinar is going to be a little different because it's also going to be going live on our website as part of our advocacy toolkit. So we're basically pulling together a bunch of different resources to be a one-stop shop for new advocates to go to. So we're really going to covering, it covers a lot of the material that's covered in this fellowship, but we don't generally share the recordings that we make for the fellowship, just so folks feel free to share. But for this topic, we are filming it for both purposes, for all of you and also to go live for everybody else. So, feel free, of course, to chime in with questions and comments, but if there's anything you want to comment on or share that you don't want to be available on the website, please hold those comments until the very end. I will stop the recording and allow folks to do that. All right? Are there any questions around that? All right, great. Go ahead and get started. So I'm going to start us off with a federal budget recap because I know all of you love the federal budget and couldn't get enough of that material. And I also know it's like a super dense two-parter training, but I definitely want to touch base and make sure that we got kind of the core information out of it. And if you have any questions, I'm going to take this time to answer it as well. I'm going to be leading the recap, but I'm definitely going to need some help from all of you. So feel free to type in the chat box or, take yourself off mute very briefly and shout out the answer before muting yourself again, just to minimize the noise if I ask you a question. So to start us off on the federal budget, why does the federal budget matter? Why is it important to know about the federal budget? Does anybody want to chime in on that?
Hello, can anybody hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. How's everyone's?
Good.
Sorry.
No worries. I'm just leading the fellows through a recap of our federal budget training. So I'm just asking folks why they think the federal budget matters. Roxy said to know how the federal funds are spent. Yes, exactly. Thank you so much. So where we spend our money says a lot about where our priorities are, and the same is true when we talk about the federal government. So the next thing is who's involved. So Congress has the authority to create and collect taxes and to borrow money when needed, but how that works has changed a lot over time because it's not actually strictly defined in the Constitution. Today, federal agencies like the Office of Management and Budget, the Government Accountability Office, and the Congressional Budget Office have the responsibility of doing most of the research and planning involved in writing up the budget. So Congress creates a new budget for our country every year. That's called the appropriations process. To appropriate meaning to put something where it's supposed to be. Now, can somebody go ahead and define what appropriation bills are? And I know I didn't ask you all to prep for a pop quiz, so it's okay if you don't know. What are appropriations bills? All right, that's right. Appropriation bills decide how much money is going to go to the different government agencies and programs. Does anybody want to define what discretionary spending is?
Hi, it's Roslyn. Let me try that. Discretionary funding is set at the discretion of the Congress every year, and in a subcommittee, I guess. But it's pretty much how the money. So let's see, mandatory spending is enacted by the law, not depending on the annual appropriations bill.
That's
but
right.
The discretion of spending is set at the district of the Congress. I can't got my tongue right now.
Yeah, no, that was really good. Yeah, so discretionary spending depends on the appropriation bills that come out every year. Mandatory spending does not. And mandatory spending is also known as entitlement spending and applies to entitlement programs, most commonly Social Security and Medicare benefits. and they're called entitlements because the government is required to pay out those benefits to anybody who is eligible for them. That was very good. Thank you, Rosalind. All right, and so the other part of it, discretionary relies heavily on appropriation bills. Mandatory spending still depends on authorization bills. Does anybody want to define what authorization bills are? Not a problem. So appropriation bills decide how much money is going to go to the different agencies, right? But authorization bills are needed to give the federal government the actual authority to spend the money that they have set aside. So that's the difference. Appropriations, deciding how much money is going to go to different places. Authorization bills gives the government the authority to spend that money. Yes. Thank you. Shanika put it even better. An authorization bill is a type of legislation used in the U.S. to authorize the activities of the various agencies and programs that are part of the federal government of the U.S. Very good. Thank you. It's always great to have a graduated fellow on the call. All right. So this is kind of the overview of that process again. So step one, federal agencies submit their budgets to the president for review. Based on that, the president submits his or her budget request to Congress, which is really a wish list. It's not binding, but when the president releases a budget, it's a really good overview of what that administration's priorities are, what they care about, what they don't. Depends heavily on what they're funding and what they're cutting. All right. After that, the House and Senate committees on the budget pass budget resolutions. Those are bills that sets the overall spending limits, but it doesn't decide how much funding each individual program actually gets. That's decided by the House and Senate appropriations subcommittees, which determine how much actual spending is allowed for each of the programs up for discussion. And there are 12 subcommittees, and they each submit their own appropriations bill. So after all 12 appropriation bills are out, the House and Senate have to vote on them. And kind of comparing what's different and working out those differences. Now, all 12 of those bills have to get signed for the budget to become law, right? So after the House and Senate vote, it goes to the president, who can then sign or veto those bills one at a time, which either does or does not pass the budget. Any questions around that so far? And all of this info is also uploaded to Canvas for your review later on as well.
Okay. I was going to ask you what the 12 were, but I guess it'll be in Canvas. Thank you.
Yes. Yes, there's always 12 subcommittees that kind of govern all the different areas where different discretionary spending areas.
Okay.
Now for bonus points, can anybody tell me what continuing resolutions are? Or what omnibus bills are? These weren't a large part of the webinar, so. Yeah, so generally the budget process is supposed to be completed by October 1st for the budget of the following year, but sometimes that doesn't always happen on time, as we know. So Congress can pass something called a continuing resolution. That allows federal agencies to continue to receive funding until a full budget is actually in place. So it's temporary funding until new appropriation bills become law. When Congress is not able to get a budget through and they're also not able to get continuing resolutions through, the government has what's called a shutdown, which happened a couple times not that long ago. Basically, the government can't afford to pay anybody, so the government has to close. Does anybody want to take on Omnibus? Right, so when Congress can't agree on 12 separate appropriation bills, it can choose to do an omnibus. I'm having so much trouble with that word today. Omnibus bill, which essentially meaning all the bills are put together into one bill that covers all of the 12 different funding areas, usually just as a tactic to make it easier to pass. So that was my really quick recap of what we covered on the federal budget webinars. Did anybody have any questions or anything they wanted to add? Yes, Shanika coming in again with a way better definition. An omnibus bill is a single document that is accepted in a single vote by a legislature, but packages together several measures into one or combines diverse subjects. Because of their large size and scope, omnibus bills limit opportunities for debate and scrutiny. Thank you so much, Shanika. All right. Anyways, once again, all of this information I am going to post up later. All right, with that, I'm gonna hand it over. So our learning objectives for today are going to be learning the basics of, sorry about the siren, everybody. Learn the basics of advocating with federal agencies, known as administrative advocacy. Second, learning about the roles of key federal agencies in implementing federal legislation and its impact on states, specifically state policies and programs. And then third, learning key strategies for engaging in administrative advocacy. And then we have some great presenters on the call with us today, starting with Carly Calhoun, who is the If, When, How Reproductive Justice HIV Fellow at Sister Love. Sister Love was founded in 1989 and is the oldest nonprofit in Georgia, dedicated specifically to the education, prevention, support, and advocacy needs of all women living with and affected by HIV, as well as their families. Carly is a graduate of the University of Alabama School of Law and uses their legal skills to advocate for and with the people that Sister Love serves, including through administrative advocacy. And we also have Shanika Hodges. She started out volunteering as a member of the Ryan White Part D Community Advisory Board for Michigan and eventually became chair. She was also active in the Positive Perspective Speakers Bureau for Michigan. Shanika became a service provider in the community as an early intervention specialist for a local AIDS service organization where she has worked for 5 years now. Shanika is also a graduate of our PWM Policy Fellowship, part of our inaugural cohort. And she is also PWN State Lead for Michigan. And then last but not least, our fearless leader, co-founder, and executive director of PWN, Nana Khanna. And I'll hand it over to all of you.
Hey, this is Carly. Thanks for having me. I think
I'm here.
Shanika, you ready to start?
Yes, I am. So it's okay, because that's the original slides right there, right?
Yep.
Because I got the one you sent me, but I'm not for sure we're looking at the same one.
Yeah, this is the master slide deck that we've all been working in.
Okie dokie, I do not have that one. The one I got is
Well,
the
I
actual overview that we had from the Speak Up Summit.
Well, I can just go ahead and start if you want to find that in your email, Shanika. Does that sound good?
Yep.
Okay. All right. So this is just a federal agencies overview. So federal agencies are housed under the executive branch. And they're made when the legislature passes enabling legislation, and they specify the powers of the agency. And typically there's 3 powers, which is rulemaking, adjudicatory, and investigative. And we can get into that on the next slide. But the point of this webinar is really, we're going to focus on rulemaking. And the structure of federal agencies, they're usually headed by a board or commission. The members are nominated by the president, and appointments are confirmed by the Senate. And usually these things change over each presidential administration down party lines, but they are typically staffed by experts in the field, and they generally stay in the agency no matter who's in charge. So there is some sort of check and balance over who's running these agencies. So we wanted to ask if anybody knew of any examples, and if you don't have any, that's okay, but if you want to type it in or speak up, you can shout it out if you can think of an example of a federal agency.
Health and Environmental Services. Who is it? Steve Mnuchin?
I think, are you thinking of the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good example. Anybody else? Oh, the CDC. That's actually housed under the Health and Human Services Agency, Department of Health and Human Services, but yes, it's a good example. Yeah, so we just have, there's housing and urban development. Yes, the FDA is a good example. Okay, Shanika found the slides. The Ryan White program and HOPWA are both programs run by agencies. So they're programs, not necessarily agencies, but yeah, HOPWA is under the Housing and Urban Development. HOPWA is housing opportunities for people living with AIDS. The Ryan White program, yep, Homeland Security. All right, I think y'all. Go ahead.
Fall under one of those.
Which one?
Energy and Commerce.
I think so. I'm not familiar with that one, but doesn't mean it doesn't exist. There are. Go ahead.
I'm not sure.
Well, there's like a lot of agencies, so I think we have some good main examples. So if we want to move to the next slide. Rebecca. All right, Shanika, you want to take this? Okay. So what's the question? Energy and Commerce is a committee, if that's what you were thinking of. Okay. There we go. All right, what do administrative agencies do? They do rulemaking, which is what we're going to focus on today, but I wanted everyone to know that they have more powers than rulemaking. So under rulemaking, administrative agencies make very specific rules, unlike statutes that Congress makes, but they can be just as powerful. And I think Shanika can take over. Do you want to?
Yeah, sorry about that. We're having a little technical difficulties here on my end. As Carly said, there was the general rulemaking, the having tongue twisters today, all day today. I don't know, but investigatory. With those who investigate certain degree determined on the violations of those federal programs, examples of those such as the Security and Exchange Commissions requiring corporations to turn over their records. So some perfect example of that will be such as the Enron scandal, as far as under that one. That would be something like that example. And then you have your adjudicatory administrative law judges, which focus on primarily Social Security on the federal and state levels. And then you have your review boards and your councils. And like I said, and examples of those would be the Social Security disability. So when you're going in for your hearing, things like that, or Department of Health and Human Services, And you have what you call the SNAP program, or, your food assistance program. And they decide how much money someone can make, and allowing states to implement employment and training programs in order to receive your food stamps, such as the Work First program, which requires in some states and Michigan, we have to work certain amount of hours or volunteer so many amount of hours, or either get medical approval for as deferment from the program. That's what those are laws, and those administrative agencies do on a federal level. Any questions? Okay. And examples of those are the presidential actions, which are the executive orders, the presidential directives, the memorandas, the proclamations, and the OMB Mirandas, reporting, the information collection. So each one has something different: reporting, disclosure, interviews, and forms of record keeping. So those are different forms of information collection. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure. And that was just, a few examples of what the rules and interpretive and guidance and advisory options that's afforded and was able to do and not to do under those federal guidelines. Next slide. Well, let me open up my screen. What? You all right, Carly? Okay. The regulation rules are any agency or statement in general applicability and future effect, which agencies intends to have the force and effect of the law, which is designed to implement and interpret and prescribe law or policy to describe the procedure of an agency. So the interpretive rule or guidance helps public understand how rules or regulations apply to them. It may explain how it interprets a rule or statute, how a rule may apply in a given instance, and what person or organization may do to comply. However, it must not set new legal standards or impose new requirements. Now we got to go to the notice of proposed rulemaking. So this is the thing that puts forward changes, additions, deletions to regulatory language for public comment, which things must include the summary of the issue and how to comment, the preamble that discuss merits of proposed solution, cites data, details, reasoning, and legal authority for the rule. The regulatory impacts analysis of costs and benefits of the required statutory of EO analysis and regulatory text of proposals, such as, a written text, either in written form and written material. This is where the fun parts come in. All righty, Carly.
Okay, here I go. So it might be hard to see. I guess you can see this slide pretty well on the screen, but I'll just go through this basic steps. So where do you come in? That's notice and comment periods, and this is where the fun stuff happens. I'm joking. So step one, so the agency creates a draft proposed rule. And step two, they'll internally approve the rule. And it can take months for them to do that or longer. And once they do that, it has to go, doesn't have to, usually goes to the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs of the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, and they review the draft. And it's important to note that the OMB only reviews significant, quote unquote, rules that pose economic effects or raise important policy issues. And so generally, like, let's say a lot of major organizations will pay attention to what's at the Office of Management and Budget, because that generally gets reported out so that they can prepare in case it's a really important rule. For example, right now we know that the Trump administration has sent some proposed rules to the OMB that will affect trans people. So a lot of organizations are trying to prepare for what that might look like for when they actually move on to step 4 and release a notice of proposed rulemaking that they publish in the Federal Register. And this is required by the Administrative Procedures Act, which that act governs how agencies work and how they can propose rules. It's really complicated, but it's just another way to keep agencies in check. And it's a way to challenge rules sometimes if they don't give enough notice, or other things that agencies tend to do. So the proposed rulemaking goes into the Federal Register. It's a physical publication, but it's also released on a website called Regulationsgov that we'll talk about in the next slide. So step 5, they offer usually a 30-day public comment period or a 60-day public comment period. It can be longer, and the public can request an extension of the comment period, and all comments are public. The agency will review those comments when it drops the final rule, making changes or taking into account all of the comments that and incorporating them or not. And then in step 7, the agency will approve the final draft within the agency. They'll draft the final rule, and it's reviewed again by the Office of Management and Budget, and then the final rule is published in the Federal Register, and then the rule is implemented. So it's a lot of information. I'm going to give you an example on the next slide. This is just a fun example of agencies in action. We call it the chocolate milk case. Let's see. So in this case, the Department of Agriculture proposed a rule affecting the WIC program. If y'all aren't familiar, it's the Women, Infants, and Children program that provides federal grants to states for supplemental foods, healthcare referrals, and nutrition education for low-income pregnant women, women raising children, and to infants and children who are found to be at nutritional risk. So the Department of Agriculture was the agency that proposed this rule, and they were trying to, it was a whole list of approved foods that were in this rule, and one of them was flavored milk. So the department received so many comments against flavored milk during the comment period that they deleted it from the approved list in the final rule. And so this is just a way of showing that if you really care about something, sometimes it actually works and they'll take it away. So anti-flavored milk activists convinced the department to remove it from the approved list. And they ended up in court because the Chocolate Manufacturers Association didn't think there was enough notice that the flavored milk would be removed from the list if adverse comments were made. And so the court decided that was unfair for affected parties. And then the court required the department to reopen the comment period. So to me, this is a lesson that you need to comment whether you approve or disapprove of a rule. And we'll get into this in a couple slides, but you can also approve of part and disapprove of another part. So does anybody have any questions so far? I talk really fast, I'm sorry. Okay. So the next slide shows, this is what Regulations.gov looks like. If you want to go there and look right now, you can. So the Federal Register, like I said, is actually a physically published copy that gets, published everywhere. I know at law schools, we just get like updated stacks of paper to put in these 3-ring binders, and other libraries. So it's, but you can go search regulations.gov and see if there's rules coming out that affect you. As you can see on the left, where it says what's trending, that's usually what, if a bunch of people are commenting on these things or searching for these terms, it'll show up over there. And you can see in the middle, there's, it tells you that there's ones that, comments that are due soon. So that's, this today, it'll say there's 29, next 3 days. So you can look through those, but really importantly is that you can just search terms that might affect you. So like at Sister Love, I once a week type in HIV and search and see if there's any new things coming out about HIV, for perhaps new studies at the CDC. Those are usually published there. And you can type for abortion, and you'd find rules affecting abortion. And when you type these things in, it comes with a full list of rules going back years. So you can narrow it down to what's still open for comment period, and it tells you the due date, and it has contact information for if you have questions about the rule. And you have until 11:59 p.m. on the day that it's due to post your comment. And they allow you to upload PDFs, or you can comment directly into the website and submit it. All right. Take it away, Shanika.
Sorry about that dang mute button because of my background. I'm on my porch. So this is where we get to put our actual comment and actually be impactful and effective in our comment section. Whatever issue that you may want to have a comment on, this is where it can get put on public record and they have to look at it. So you can be a for or against, but you have to address all the proposed rule or only in part. It can be as simple as a sentence, as many pages, and as points as you want. There is no page limit, but I would like for you ladies to keep in mind, the more concise and simpler and shorter, the better. So just if you can get straight to the point, the better, because there are so many comments coming in and they may not take the time to read it, even though they have to do it. That doesn't always happen. So constructive comments hold more weight, and anything in particular, expertise because of your work, that even builds more points. So make sure you put to note that first. provide alternatives. So if you agrees with the agency, suggest how, you know, things can be different and might be more effective. So don't always come, I would say, not come with the problem, but always try to come with a solution or recommendation with that, providing alternatives. And then your last one, you want to support your comment with facts and data. So if you have it, put that on there, note it, slide it, you know, cite it. And that would be more better for you, because if it's not cited and you're trying to get your point across, and it's and if it is data, put it out there so they can see it, because they may not know that that data exists. And you are your expert, and your opinion matters. So we're going to look at some tips for effective comments. First, I would like for you to read it thoroughly and take your time. Start as early as possible in a period given to give yourself a time frame to absorb the information, because some people like to scan it and go through it and, you know, fish through it and can absorb it pretty quick. Now, me, on my other hand, I say this, but yeah, it may take me some time to absorb the information. So I can gather all the information in that day, but when I come home, I get in my little mode and I'll sit and absorb it and read it thoroughly. That way I got time to comprehend what I'm reading so I can make an effective comment. And if you don't understand something or need help with that, usually it's the clunky language or that jargon that we like, that legalese, that what they like to use. Reach out for it. You know, ask somebody in that agency that what you know, you're commenting on, reach out to them and ask them for a clear definition if you may need that help. Talk to your network to see if they may, you know, have that answer to that. But there's always someone to guide you when you're having problems with that issue. And like, again, use your citations to the page number or part of the rule you're talking about. And you can also comment on other comments as well. Cite the comment in the ID if you do feel so. Form letters. For example, I've had the ladies in my Part D CAG group back in, this was a while ago, my first time starting this, and it was something going on with our legislators and our governor. I think at that time it was Jennifer Granholm. She was the governor, and we formed letters as a CAG, you know, as a whole, but they wrote individual letters to send to the governor's office and Debbie Stabenow, and to know how these services were being impacted, and if, you know, their funds were being cut at the time. So we needed our voices to be heard. So we formed letters as a group, and I think that's more effective as well. Next slide.
All right, so I think that brings us to the end of the administrative commenting piece specifically. I'll open it up for questions on that. All right, I have one. So in the current administration, I know we're getting a lot of executive orders, which then lead to a lot of rules being made and being proposed by agencies. Can you talk a little bit more about how that works? Like what are executive orders? What are their roles in the rulemaking process? Things like that. That would be really helpful.
I guess I'll go.
Yeah, you can take that one, Carly.
Okay.
Because my daughter was asking me a question right quick. I'm sorry.
That's okay. So executive orders usually, let's say, for example, President Obama released an executive order about how an agency should enforce protections for transgender folks in school settings. And so that just like tells the agency how they should enforce certain rules. And then, but like the thing with executive orders is that they are subject to being overturned by executive orders in an administration after that. So Trump has come in and also released an executive order taking that away. So it's a little bit not complicated, but so I guess the executive orders are just sort of, because the president does have power over the agencies, because they're housed under the executive branch, there's not much of a check on how executive orders can be released. Am I right? Is that right, Rebecca?
That sounds right to me. Thank you, Carly. Yeah, so what I really wanted to point it out is we see a lot of executive orders, but we talked a lot about how Congress is responsible for making laws. So I know sometimes that can be a little bit confusing about the administration seeming to make law, but executive orders aren't law in terms of they can be overturned. If a new administration comes in, that's very common. The current administration, as Carly said, is doing a lot, just rolling back previous regulations and previous executive orders. That happens a lot. And it's not law just by itself. Executive orders rely heavily on agencies involved to create the regulations to make it happen. So I know there's always a lot of alarming executive orders out there, but that just means there's going to be a comment period coming up soon, and that's always a good opportunity to start looking that up and seeing what the deadlines are and formulating comments. It's always really helpful, whether or not you're support or you're against a policy, to jump in and make that known. And then Shanika wanted to say the constitutional basis for the executive order is the president's broad power to issue executive directives. According to Congressional Research Service, there is no direct definition of executive orders, presidential memoranda, and proclamations in the US Constitution, and no specific provision authorizing them. But the Constitution does give executive powers to the president, making him commander-in-chief, and that requires that the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Laws can also give additional powers to the president. And then we had a question from Chris. Is there a way you go if you wanted to make work-related requirements more accessible, especially for people with disabilities, to receive public assistance by going to the regulations.org? Is this about Medicare work requirements, Chris? Yes. Okay, so can you walk us through how that would work? Chris wants to leave a comment related to, the proposal of work requirements for Medicare. How would they get started on that?
Did they already propose a rule on that? I'm not sure Medicaid works at the state level. Yeah. Nana might be able to speak more to that. We haven't gotten involved in that, even though I'm familiar with it. I think if they release a rule, or if they have released a rule, then you can go look it up and comment. But yeah, so what's happened now is that the agency has made it so that they will accept state requirements to enforce work requirements, but it's not at the national Medicaid rules are not requiring work requirements. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. Nana, did you want to dig more into that?
I'll add what I know, and maybe, I don't know if Arnita's on and can also add, but a lot of the Medicaid work requirement stuff is actually, it's being proposed. So what CMS, the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, which is the federal agency that oversees Medicare and Medicaid, did issue a rule basically allowing states to add work requirements to their program. That has now been instituted. It's already in place. It was a waiver program. So states can apply for waivers to add work requirements to their Medicaid program. There's no way to push back on that, as far as I know, at the federal level right now, other than, maybe some lawsuits and things like that. But for advocates to engage, the best place that I know of that advocates can engage is at the state level. So it depends on where your state is in the process. If they've already adopted work requirements for the program, that's something that you can work through administrative advocacy at your state level to try to undo in the same type of way. So setting up meetings, organizing the community to do some meetings with your state level Medicaid office, your Department of Health might be a good place to start. If they haven't already applied for the waiver for work requirements. So I think about 12 states have waivers in process or already accepted right now. So your state may or may not be one of those. If they don't already, the best thing to do is to try to stop it before it happens. So if you are hearing that they're trying to introduce Medicaid work requirements in your states, it's time to start, like raising hell about that by going to the state capitol or, and, setting up meetings with legislators, meeting with the state health department, definitely getting HIV advocates on board for that. So I don't know if that's helpful and if anybody wants to add anything.
Yeah, thank you, Nana. That was great. Were there any other questions around that or something else we covered? All right, well, I think that's a good segue since Nana is on the mic to transition over to doing informal administrative advocacy, and Nana's going to walk us through that.
Great, thanks so much, Rebecca and Carly and Chanika. What a great presentation. I'm learning a lot. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that PWN has done to sort of almost behind the scenes kind of uplift this issue around linking trauma and HIV to raise the visibility of trauma as an issue that's impacting people living with HIV and get some federal agencies to make commitments around it. And so you can go to the next slide. So back in 2008, when PWN was formed, does anybody remember what was happening in 2008? It was a long time ago, 10 years ago. It was a very exciting time. It was a really exciting election year. We had, the potential of Obama being elected. PWM was formed in June of 2008. It was during primary season, right after primary season in the general election cycle. But we really didn't know whether the next president was going to be Obama or McCain at that time. And so we realized that right after our first meeting, we started to sort of get involved as a network in doing federal policy work. And we realized that a lot of organizations around October or November, so shortly after we formed, were putting together basically white papers, which is like a set of policy recommendations to submit to the incoming transition team. A transition team is what a new administration sets in place before they take office. So between the time of the election in November and January, the time of inauguration, as soon as the presidential election happens, or even a mayoral election or other elections for major offices, a transition team is put in place to sort of like start, landscaping, start thinking about who they're going to be appointing into key offices, what their priorities are going to be, and everything. And so we realized that it was a priority to make sure women living with HIV were on the radar. A lot of other HIV groups were already doing this and had, much more capacity than we did. We didn't even have one staff person at this point. But a lot of these big national organizations were putting forth recommendations, and we realized that none of the recommendations were really focused on people living with HIV, let alone women living with HIV. So together we wrote, kind of over a couple of months over lots of conference calls and webinars, the 28 of us who founded PWN in 2008 wrote a set of policy recommendations for the incoming administration, not knowing which administration it was going to be yet. And we submitted that, after Obama was elected, we submitted it to the transition team in November of 2008 with the help of our allies. We didn't know how to reach the transition team, but big organizations that were in DC did. And so we reached out to them and said, hey, we have recommendations. Where do we send them? And so we got the email address of somebody to send them to on Obama's transition team, who was sort of overseeing health. So we submitted our recommendations, and I think what was really sort of historic about this is it was the first time that any policy document written entirely by people living with HIV, as far as we know, had ever been submitted to a sitting US administration. on, in relation to domestic policy. So we submitted that in November 2008, and that was that turned out to be a really smart thing we did, which we didn't really know. Like we were more coming at it from, we don't want to be left out. But they had our document. It went into a big binder full of lots of HIV recommendation documents. And so what happened was, about a month after the election, they were starting to convene these community calls, like different types of stakeholder phone calls, on different health issues that they were taking on. And actually, the LGBT, there was an LGBT liaison. There wasn't an HIV liaison yet. The administration hadn't yet, I think, decided to really prioritize HIV. Even though they had made a commitment in the campaign cycle to create a national HIV/AIDS strategy. So the LGBT liaison was doing a community stakeholder call, and we were one of the organizations invited to that call because they had received our recommendations. So we were on a call probably with about 40 or 50 people from HIV and LGBT organizations to sort of be briefed a little bit on what the new administration was thinking, and for them to hear what some of our priorities were. So that was our first interaction with the Obama-Biden administration. You can go to the next slide. So next slide, sorry. So also, we knew that the National HIV/AIDS strategy was going to be a priority. For the community had done a lot of pushing to make it a priority. We had gotten, in the 2008 election cycle, all of the major presidential candidates to commit to a national HIV/AIDS strategy if they were elected. So the other thing we realized we needed to do is we couldn't just do this work alone. We needed to build coalition. And so with a group of other women and HIV-focused organizations, we developed another document about 7 or 8 months later that it actually took a long time to develop. So we worked on it probably from about February until July when it was ready for release. And it was a more expansive document that incorporated PWMs recommendations, but also looked at some other stuff we didn't have expertise in or a direct stake in, like organizational priorities for women serving organizations, for example. And so we submitted a second set of recommendations as they were getting closer to developing their strategy. Also around this time, in July of 2009, the Obama administration was appointing their first White House Office of National AIDS Policy director. And so we wanted to make sure that director had a sense of what was important to us. And so that's who these recommendations went to, was Jeff Crowley, who was the first ONAP director under the Obama administration. So when the strategy came out in 2010, July of 2010, a year after this document went into ONAP, we knew what we were looking to see, right? So basically our next step from there was to analyze the strategy and say, how well did it meet what we consider to be priorities for women living with HIV in the United States? So we released a monitoring report, and we basically graded the strategy on the same priorities that we had put in our original document. And so we graded the strategy in a bunch of different areas. I think there were like 6 or 7 different areas, like legal, access to healthcare, prevention for women, things like that. And we basically gave the strategy overall a C+. We said, there's lots of room for improvement. And that was sort of generous, frankly. We didn't want to burn our bridges with the new administration, which is why we gave them the C+. We wanted to keep working with them, but we wanted them to be really clear that they were on notice, because the first strategy didn't address anything really that was women specific. Folks of trans experience were very sort of underrepresented in the strategy. Stigma and discrimination were addressed, but the structural context we felt was not quite adequately addressed. So there were a bunch of gaps. There was no mention of violence, intimate partner violence. There was no mention of trauma. And we knew that these were issues that are very important to all people living with HIV, but are particularly important to women. And so that was what we were trying to uplift in this is kind of like a report card that we produced. So you can go to the next slide. So, oh, I don't know what that is. Okay, thanks. So, you know, over the next couple of years, we did a lot of advocacy. It was different kinds of advocacy. We had meetings with people at the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, to kind of reiterate our priorities. And this wasn't just PWN having the meetings, it was a larger coalition called 30 for 30 that included a number of different women in HIV organizations, including Sister Love, which was one of the founding members. And we would ask for meetings with key people at the Department of Health and Human Services as they continued to make new hires or new appointments in the Office of National AIDS Policy. We would use that as a reason to ask for another meeting to go over our priorities. And then also, we had a couple of members who had been appointed to the President's Advisory Council on HIV and AIDS. And that was, again, you know, because they knew who we were, because we submitted that document back in 2008. So when it became time for the Office of National AIDS Policy to name people to the President's Advisory Council on HIV AIDS, they already had us on their radar. And if they were trying to check a box on women in HIV, we helped them check that box. So we ended up getting a couple of seats on PACHA. And by doing a lot of work and organizing on PACHA, some of which you can kind of see here. So we had sort of an inside-outside strategy even at PACHA. And PACHA, you can kind of imagine, if you haven't been in one of those meetings, it's basically sort of like a planning council meeting. So people who are on the council are sitting around a table and you know, can vote, but then members of the public can be there and listen and participate and provide public comment. So we absolutely had an inside-outside strategy at the PACHA where our folks on PACHA were pushing certain things like inclusion of trauma, inclusion of violence, getting a resolution on women living with HIV to be incorporated into the National HIV/AIDS strategy. And then also we had community advocates lined up with talking points who were coming up to the mic, making their public comments. And we did this sort of a number of times until we got one meeting of the Presidential Advisory Council on HIV/AIDS. This is almost 2 years after the National HIV/AIDS strategy had been released and we were raising the alarm. We finally got a PACHA meeting to focus on women and girls. And so we basically put together the agenda for that meeting together with the White House. And when I say we, I mean the women-focused groups on PACHA and the 30 for 30 campaign kind of worked on this together to construct an agenda for this meeting that would like really thoughtfully raise the issues we thought were most important. So that we had lots of meetings before the meeting to make sure the meeting focused on what we thought were the priorities, and because we wanted to get that all on record, right? So next slide, please. So finally, we were able to get a resolution on women from the PACHA. Basically, it passed a resolution, I think it said, addressing the critical role and unique needs of women living with and affected by HIV. We literally were like writing this resolution in this meeting. We were updating it, you know, people were sitting in the audience, people were sitting at the table. We were like emailing the document back and forth until it was ready for it to be introduced at the meeting. And so finally we got this resolution basically committing to elevate the focus on women in the National HIV/AIDS strategy. You can go to the next slide. So we also around the same time got got ONAP, the Office of National AIDS Policy, to have the White House establish a federal interagency working group, which basically means a working group that crosses different federal agencies and to prioritize the issue that we wanted to raise primarily, which was the intersection of HIV, violence against women and girls, and gender-related health disparities. And so the reason this was so important to us is because, as we all know, violence is a huge issue in many different forms, interpersonal and structural violence, as it impacts people living with HIV, but especially for women. We had already seen earlier this year the data that over 30% of women living with HIV in the US are also living with post-traumatic stress disorder. You know, many of us, I think like 61%, have some kind of history of sexual assault, other forms of violence and trauma. And so we really wanted to make sure that this issue wasn't being missed in our national domestic plan to address the epidemic. And so the federal interagency working group included lots of different agencies and departments to work on this. You can go to the next slide. So we also were working in different ways to sort of advance this focus. So we were advocating for its inclusion in the strategy, but they kept saying we need more research. So we pulled together a meeting with the UCSF Women's HIV Program. We reached out to a researcher named Eddie Mochtinger, who is actually the person who originally published the paper that said 30% of women living with HIV in the US have PTSD. He published this academic paper in a journal in early 2012. And it was a meta-analysis, which means it was looking at lots of different studies to look at these rates. And so we co-convened a meeting with Dr. Eddie Mochtinger and PWN to develop a model of trauma-informed primary care for women living with HIV, because we realized that we needed to have a solution to propose. And so it was a small meeting of kind of key stakeholders, and it was very research focused, but it was about 25 to 30 people total. I think almost all of them are in this picture. And you might recognize a few of these folks. So of course we wanted to make sure women living with HIV were there. So you can see Vanessa Johnson's there, I'm there, I think Linda Scruggs was there, although she may not be in this photograph. Some of the researchers we had were at the back here, you can see Dr. Gina Brown from NIH, who's a great research ally. We also had some folks who work at community-based organizations. On the stairs, that person in the black dress is Liz Brosnan, who used to be the executive director of Christie's Place in San Diego. A lot of these other people are researchers, but a couple of the key folks that also helped us move this forward, and these were strategic invites, were we invited the former ONAP director, Jeff Crowley, so that he could help us, he could get more invested in this issue and help us advance this. We also invited people from some federal agencies, like the Department of Veterans Affairs and SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. So you can go to the next slide. Okay, so in addition, we continued to have sort of meetings with the HRSA HIV/AIDS Bureau. So here you can see in this photo, this is Dr. Eddie Mochtinger, who produced the data, and myself meeting with Antigone Dempsey, who you may or may not know is like a data expert person at HRSA-HAB, and also happens to be a woman openly living with HIV, working at HRSA HIV/AIDS Bureau, which oversees the Ryan White program. And so what we were able to get by September 2013, when the Interagency Federal Working Group produced its first report, was a clear commitment to trauma-informed care. So there was nothing in the original National HIV/AIDS strategy about trauma or violence, but in this report, there was a really clear commitment, recommended action 2.2, to develop, implement, and evaluate models that integrate trauma-informed care into services for women living with HIV. So that was sort of one of our first kind of successes that could be seen and documented. You can go to the next slide. Also, we saw this percolate into other federal agencies, and we were continuing to meet with these other agencies. We got invited to participate, Eddie and I got invited to participate on a kind of like advisory group for SAMHSA. SAMHSA was creating basically guidance on a trauma-informed approach, and they invited us to participate on a work group, which actually still meets, and I still participate on it. And it has continued to produce materials to develop trauma-informed approaches for service delivery in mental health and substance use settings. And so you see here that SAMHSA published something in July of 2014 they were already starting to move in that direction, but I think we really helped them think more about incorporating the lens of people living with HIV in this work. You can go on the next slide. We also saw the CDC publish a fact sheet on this as a result of the, a lot of community pressure and the advocacy that was happening. So the CDC released a fact sheet in November of 2014 on the intersection of intimate partner violence and HIV. And part of what we were really trying to push back on was this framing at the time that was really dominant, that was like, the only way people were talking about intimate partner violence and HIV was that intimate partner violence was a risk factor for HIV. And we said, well, yeah, that might be true, but we really want to talk about how violence continues to impact people after they're diagnosed with HIV. That's what we're really concerned about. We're concerned about the fact that women living with HIV are at greater risk for violence. Disclosure can lead to violence. Our HIV status can make us vulnerable to coercion and abuse. And also, by the way, all that trauma history doesn't just go away once we get an HIV diagnosis. And actually, you can't really heal people just through HIV medications. So the reason that women living with HIV are dying today, even today in 2018, is not because of HIV mostly. It's usually because of depression, organ failure, addiction, and other things that are directly related to trauma. So the addiction and trauma are so interrelated. And so we said what we really need to do is be supporting people to heal, and we need you to take that part up as a priority. So we got the CDC to release this fact sheet that talks about IPV as a risk factor for HIV, but it also talks a bit about the fact that HIV itself could make women more vulnerable to intimate partner violence. Next slide, please. So then in 2015, we published a paper from that meeting we had back in 2013, that stakeholder meeting I told you about. So this is a paper that was co-authored by myself, Eddie Mochtinger, and a few other people who were at that meeting. Everybody at the meeting contributed to this paper, but you can only list a few authors on a journal publication. So we were able to get a journal article, and this was also important because this is important but not necessary. But you know how a lot of times policymakers say, well, where's the literature on this? So we wanted to be able to say there is literature on this. So we created the literature on it. We wrote an article and submitted it to journals, and we're able to get it published. And it's a pretty accessible article in terms of it's easy to read. I think it's also open access. So you can find it online if you want to read it. It's sort of an early version of our thinking about trauma-informed primary care for people living with HIV. Next slide, please. This is the model we came up with. I won't spend a lot of time going into this, but this is sort of like the model that we were presenting and training folks on, and that we've continued to advance. Is this model of trauma-informed primary care that we want to be incorporated into every Ryan White setting. Next slide, please. Thank you. We also saw other types of groups take this up, and that really helped a lot. We could not have done this alone as community-based organizations or even just women in HIV organizations. So AIDS United produced a fact sheet. They hosted a congressional briefing to address the intersection of domestic violence and HIV among women. And this is how collaboration and sort of the echo chamber effect really makes a difference. And also this very much applies on a local level. When you're working to change something at the local level, if you can get lots of different stakeholders talking about it in different ways, that very much helps. Next slide, please. So finally, in 2015, the new version of the National HIV/AIDS Strategy was released, and it was better. It included some of the stuff we had been asking for. So it included, if you look here at step 2C2, improve outcomes for women in HIV care by addressing violence and trauma and factors that increase risk for violence for women and girls living with HIV. This was a huge thing that wasn't in the first strategy. some of these other things, of course, all of these other things, of course, were also good for women, but that was a particular one that we have been trying to move. So I just wanted to highlight that. So that was the new version of the strategy that came out in July 2015 that goes through 2020. Next slide, please. So at the same time, we were also trying to, as I said, change the Ryan White program to be more trauma informed. And that's something that we have continued to work on. We think that, you know, Ryan White is the program that serves over half of all people living with HIV in the US. And women in particular tend to have much better outcomes in the Ryan White program than in other, than if they're not receiving Ryan White care. So we said, like, what would it look like if we transformed the whole Ryan White system to be a trauma-informed care system? That means it is like screening folks for trauma and violence. It's also providing healing from trauma through different types of interventions that might be, you know, from like mental health services to stuff that's more like somatic-based, yoga, meditation, art therapy, different kinds of things. So we were really trying to push this, and for our National Day of Action to End Violence Against Women Living with HIV, which happens every year on October 23rd, in 2015, we decided to make this our priority. So we did a big sign-on letter to send stuff to HRSA. We had a bunch of people sign on to a letter to HRSA, the Health Resources and Service Administration, which oversees the Ryan White program. Asking them to make trauma-informed care a reality in that program. And of course, we cited the new National HIV/AIDS strategy in our letter because, you know, it's always good to cite the federal government when you're talking to the federal government. Next slide, please. So we did, you know, we did start to get some things out of the HRSA department at the HIV/AIDS Bureau. They produced a presentation and a report on trauma and HIV in December of 2015. You can go to the next slide. Also, at HHS, the Administration for Children and Families produced this article on trauma-informed services for HIV positive and HIV at-risk individuals. Next slide, please. And then just last year, HRSA created a huge new grant that's supposed to be it's sort of like testing new interventions type of grant. It's a big multi-year grant. I think it's a 3-year grant that has 4 focus areas. And all of these are important. Improving health outcomes for transgender women living with HIV, improving health outcomes for Black men who have sex with men, integrating behavioral health with primary medical care, and number 4, identifying and addressing trauma among people living with HIV. So this was a huge win for us. We got basically HRSA to commit to a 3-year major funding cycle to fund 6 sites to basically develop best practices on addressing trauma among people living with HIV. And the reason this matters is because anytime HRSA does something, it gets a lot of evaluation, right? So they have evaluators, they require a lot of evaluation. They're looking at client level data and client level outcomes. And if this is done well, it could lead to, it'll probably lead to several published papers by HRSA people, by HRSA authors, as well as outside authors that are basically creating more evidence in the literature that trauma-informed care is needed and what makes it work well. Next slide, please. So yeah, that's kind of where we are. And today, actually, actually just yesterday, the new progress report on the National HIV/AIDS strategy was released. We are still going through it to see what's in there relevant to this issue, if anything. Given this administration, I would imagine that there may not be a lot, but I hope that folks can think about how, you know, this was an example of administrative advocacy with a friendly administration, which we do not have right now in DC. However, we still have a lot of friends in these federal agencies, and it's not impossible to move things in the same type of way by there are lots of good career people who have been at HHS, CDC, NIH for a long time who really care about people living with HIV. And by the same token, there are a lot of people in your state departments who care as well. And exactly these same strategies can be applied to your own state level work. So I'll stop there and just see if there are any questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Nana. I'll open it up. Were there any questions on Nana's presentation around informal admin advocacy? I know Olga mentioned on the call that she was familiar with, you know, this whole process to get all of this new material added. So any questions around that? Also, Shanika had to hop off early to finish a paper, but Carly is still on the line in case there were questions around the earlier piece as well.
Rebecca,
Yeah.
I just wanted to thank Nana and Carly and the other one for the presentation today. Yeah, and thank Nana for that little history on how we got started. That was really awesome. A lot of work went into that, and I'm just grateful to be a part of it. So thank you, guys.
Awesome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
All right, there are no more questions. I'll say a huge shout out. Thank you, Nana. Thank you, Carly. And thank you to Shanika. That was great. I'm just going to do logistics with the fellows now, so feel free to hop off the call. And then I am also going to go ahead and stop recording. All right.